And when you see a Christian being excited about the gospel, this is the thing that absolutely electrifies and energizes our heart. It is because what is so wondrous about the gospel is that everywhere you look in the Bible, you'll realize it's a story of something that's not fair. Every part of it points to this. If you just read this book and you read it like one big story, although it's written at many different periods of time under many different pens, it's one big story. What you'll see is that all the little stories are pointing to a big story. And the little stories are mostly about something that's incredibly unfair. So God calls a man named Abram. Abram. We don't know anything about Abram. The main thing we realize is that we're not told anything about good karma in Abram's life. We don't know anything about Abram. He gets called up out of the Ur of the Chaldees, and God gives him an unconditional, unilateral promise that He's going to bless him, that He's going to make His name great, that He's going to bless people through him, that He's going to be a father of a nation. Why Abram? Well, you say because Abram was so righteous. Really? Abram also lied and told king that this wasn't his wife Sarah. My wife, she's got some problems with Abram over this. Abram was no perfect man whatsoever. He was just favored by God, and that's not fair. And you just keep reading the stories and you'll realize this is we've been talking about. Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were twins, but Esau was the firstborn. In that culture, the firstborn was going to get a double portion of the inheritance. That's not fair. And was going to get a special blessing from the father. And that's not fair. And Jacob, realizing how unfair all this was, spent his whole life conniving so that he would put himself into first place so he would get the blessing. And he went in and tricked his father into blessing him rather than Esau, who deserved the blessing. And because of this, we know God to be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not of Esau. And there were two peoples that were formed. And so it was that Jacob is the one through whom the promise came. And that wasn't fair. There's not one shred of fairness in that whole story. And then I just told you about Joseph and how he was mistreated, and yet he became the prime minister of Egypt. And that's not fair. How in the world did that come to pass? And you just keep reading the stories and you'll come to the whole story of the people of God who are enslaved in Egypt. That's not fair. But then they are brought out by the blood of the Lamb because they were given a revelation that the Egyptians were not given. And the people who knew about the blood of the Lamb were saved, and the people who weren't, they were doomed. And that's not fair. And then they come to the Red Sea, and God opened up the Red Sea, and He took the people through, but He swallowed up the other army, and that doesn't seem fair. And when they get on the other side, the people of God rejoice, but pretty soon they're complaining, and that's not fair either. And so the story just continues until you get to where they get a king. And they get a king named Saul, and he's no good. And so they go and they anoint through Samuel's oil the youngest of the sons of Jesse. He was a shepherd out in the fields. If anybody was going to become the new king, it should have been his older brothers. It should have been the firstborn. These guys were in line. They deserved to be more honored. David was just a lowly one. And he was appointed to be the new king of Israel. That's not fair. And David is a wonderful king. And David does wonderful things. And the borders of Israel are secure. But then there arise a divided monarchy. And the people of God, they rebel against God. And nations trample little Israel. And the story just over and over is just the unfairness of it all. The prophets. Well, that's a whole other story. People like Hosea, who is a seemingly righteous prophetic leader, is told by God to go marry a prostitute. That's not fair. On and on the stories go until there's a baby born in Bethlehem. And God picks out this woman, Mary. And we want, in some religious way, to make it seem like Mary was just more special, more righteous, more wonderful than everybody else. She didn't sin like other people. That's not the story. The story is that God came to this woman who had no regal splendor and no other reason why she should be so honored, except God just said, you found favor. And Jesus was born. And he lived a perfect life. He lived a life without flaw. He only intended good, and he only did good. And what he deserved was only blessing and favor in return. But instead, he went to the cross. And there as he bled and suffocated to death, and the sky grew dark, and the Son of God died, he looked down from the cross and said, God, my Father, I want you to do something that's so incredibly unfair. Forgive them. To be a Christian is to experience an incredible exchange in which Jesus becomes your sin and you become his righteousness. You can never understand the magnitude of the gospel or appropriate the fullness of the infilling of the Holy Spirit until you fully and finally accept this. Favor isn't fair. It is the gift of God for those who do not deserve it. What we need from God is his favor, and we can only receive it by the rich kindness that he's shown us in Jesus Christ. Therefore, when you accept Christ forever and for all eternity, you have become, just as Mary was told, a highly favored one. Do not be afraid. You have found favor with God. And that's the gospel.